Hello, welcome. My name is Ligia Gomez. I'm consultative sales representative here at MARCIVE. We're always really grateful to have libraries do these online presentations for our customers so they can get an idea of how the project is going to play out. So without further ado, we welcome Beth Pignally Camden, the Goldstein Director of Information Processing from the University of Pennsylvania Libraries.
Welcome, everyone, and I'm here today to talk about the MARCIVE Data Enrichment Project at the University of Penn Libraries. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background on this project. Penn Libraries have not done vendor authority processing for approximately 25 years, and that's longer than I've worked at the university. And I recall when I first arrived, our metadata management librarian had reams and reams of papers from that long ago authority project of reports that were never followed up on. And so when we moved to Voyager, we had really did not do any comprehensive authority work. We did NACO work for original cataloging. We updated authorities when problems are reported, but we weren't systematically doing authority work for copy cataloging. And so we knew that we had a lot of headings that were outdated. In 2017, when Penn migrated to Alma, it was a very rapid migration, a quick time frame between when we made the decision to move and when we actually went live. And we during that time, we did not have the option of taking our database out to a vendor to clean it up, which was my hope at the time. It just wasn't in the cards. We did have a whole list of projects that we tried to complete before the migration. Some were completed, some weren't, but authority control was not part of that. So when we moved to Alma, we knew that there were Alma authority jobs. The two jobs that I'm referring to are the authorities linked bib headings job, which from the documentation links bibliographic headings to matching authority headings, preferred and non-preferred. And the ones that are linked to non-preferred are marked to be corrected with the preferred term correction job, which is the next job on the report. Both of these things work in tandem to keep authority headings up to date in bibliographic records as the authority file is updated. But these jobs did not work on the millions of records that we had migrated from Voyager. And for those of you that have come over from Voyager, probably know about this problem. And there's off and on discussions on the Alma L list about what you might do to mitigate this problem, including some suggestions for how we might do some batch cleanup methods, which we did try, though it was not consistent enough for us to do a massive run through with these attempts through the whole database. So this is how we decided that we needed to pursue an external vendor solution. And it had been my dream since we moved over to do this, and I had suggested it at various times over the years. But the end result is the MARCIVE project that I'm going to talk about today. So we tackled the project, and this is sort of a high-level overview of what we did, and I'll go into a lot more detail later on in the presentation. We set up the project with two phases. The first was our pre-Alma records. We excluded e-resources, not for any particular reason, except it was easier for us to pull the sets out that way. And then the second phase was all the post-Alma records and all of the e-resources, excluding the community zone records. And for both phases, we did a data extract from Alma, sent it to MARCIVE for processing, and then reloaded back into Alma. And then I'll go into a lot of detail about those. Who was involved in this project? Well, I was the lead, but we also engaged with a lot of cataloging and metadata librarians from our various units that do general cataloging, global resources, things with non-English scripts in them, e-resources, metadata, special collections, and music. And this whole team of metadata librarians looked at the profile when we were preparing it. They reviewed the test file, they came back, and they reported problems. So without this group of people, we really couldn't have finished the project. We also had a systems programmer Catherine Schultz, who was critical for the extract and the reload. And she also played the role of being the conduit to the ex libris support team, which we did need quite a bit during this project. And then, of course, the administration and the business office handling the budget approval and the invoicing. I'm going to spend a little time talking about our timeline, and because it was a very tight timeline, and it was, but we finished the project and in time. We had to, because of budget constraints, we had to complete the project by the end of the fiscal year. We had only started exploring the idea of doing this in March. And so during that time, we got some preliminary quotes from vendors and ran it through the budget process to get the one-time funding approved at the end of March. And then we spent some time in April with the profiling. And it's was a great back and forth with MARCIVE during this process. They even took a sample file from us so we could get an improved quote before we had the final purchase order approved in May. And so you can see that we spent a lot of time in the front that would have been better to have later in the project when we had a very tight time frame. So once we got the purchase order in the middle of May, we then started with phase one. For phase one, we started the record extract on the 17th, and in the evening, it was finished on the 18th and sent off to MARCIVE. And so from the 18th till the end of the load of phase one, we had a cataloging freeze for those records. And because this set was the things that were done pre-Alma, we were able to give people good guidelines for what they couldn't edit during that time period. So there wasn't a huge impact. The biggest impact of the cataloging freeze that I was aware of was there was some batch work that needed to happen to add URLs for digitized items, and that had to be set aside for this time period. And then there were just staff that forgot, and a few records got edited in the meantime, but it wasn't enough to be a big problem. So we sent the big file. We got a sample file for review 2 days later, and that was 20,000 records, and we gave ourselves a week to do the review. And this is where the team of cataloging and metadata librarians were terrific in reviewing the records and sending back concerns. And we pulled these all together in a spreadsheet and then prepared a list of questions, concerns, and problems that we send off to MARCIVE. And there was some back and forth about some of the problems. And we discovered, for example, some of the things that reported the problems were actually caused by the load profile that we used. So they weren't really problems with MARCIVE's work, but with how we had set up the reload. And we did some tweaking of our profile, and it was approved on June the 1st, and the entire first set was then returned to the libraries on June the 6th. So a very short period of time for processing millions and millions of records at MARCIVE. And then we commenced our Alma reload, and this took from June 7th to the 10th, which is longer than we had expected. We did have a lot of back and forth with the Alma ex libris support and our IT person to resolve problems, and it was really critical that the support actually was able to prioritize the reload job because it took a tremendous amount of time and resources from the system. The second phase, which I mentioned earlier, was all the records that were post Alma, from when we implemented Alma to the present, and then all of the e-resources. This part of the project took less time because we didn't have the sample review. We had done that in the first phase. We didn't have to do it. The profile was okay. And these were returned on June the 20th, and then the Alma load started. And at this point, we had to continue to work with the support to problems with the reload job, and also with other jobs in the queue had to be canceled, and because we really needed to get these done. And it was a very tight timeline because we were getting to the end of our fiscal year, and we needed to be sure we could do our fiscal year rollover at the appropriate time. So a lot of time stress in this process. And when you look back at the time, one of the places we could have made it better is if we could have moved through the profiling and budgeting process earlier before we actually got the okay to go forward. But water under the bridge. And but that was one of the lessons, that this is just, it was hard to do in this tight time frame and fit it in before the end of the fiscal year. So what did we have MARCIVE do? And I mentioned the profile with them earlier. And this is sort of a summary. It's a lot more detailed than the profile. And if you go through this process, there's lots of questions to answer, and you can make choices that work for your library. For me personally, the important thing was the authority work, updating the headings for names and subject headings. But there were a lot of other things that came along with that. And one of those is upgrading the records to RDA. And this was a bonus, and I think it had a greater impact than I thought it was going to. There's a lot more of consistency in our records now that all of our older cataloging was upgraded to RDA. Updating outdated coding, and for example, we had thousands of things with outdated language codes in the fixed field that have been updated. And this has been a pet project of mine over the years, and it was great to see that fixed. And then the enrichment part of the project is really what sold this to the administration. Adding in tables of contents and summary notes has such a user impact. It improves keyword searching, and it just really increases the importance of the records and finding things. And this is what really sold it to the administration, the user impact. And then finally, we also took advantage of a service that MARCIVE offers to add local subject headings for to improve access for outdated and offensive terms. Like many of you, we're working on DEI improvements to our catalog, and this was an option for us that was important. And I will talk some more about this later. I wanted to show you some of the numbers of our processing because it does show you the magnitude of this list, of the scope of this project was huge. And as you can see, nearly all of our records were updated. So we sent 6.5 million, and of those 6.4 were updated. We added over 100,000 table of contents and over 300,000 summary notes. Lots of fodder for good keyword searching there. And then this incredible number at the end, the number of terms that were examined and updated. So we updated 28 million headings in the records. Huge improvement. So like any project, there are always little stumbling points along the way. And I thought I'd just highlight a couple of these. I don't think that any of these were critical stoppers, but they were, I just wanted to mention some of them. And I should note that given the size of the numbers I just talked about, these problems were a tiny, tiny percentage of the whole. So things that were caused by the MARCIVE processing, in a couple cases we had repeated 100 or 245 fields that were not able to load those records. Only a few of these. For music RDA coding, there was one instance that affected a lot of records, but it was a simple fix for us. And that was one of the coding that represented the type of recording it was. And there were some typos in codes that we also reported back to MARCIVE. We had a very odd problem, which doesn't occur very often, when numbers in the parallel fields with Arabic script were corrupted in the process. And it didn't happen to all numbers, but again, it was another problem that was very rare, but we reported it because we wanted to be sure that it wouldn't be a problem in the future for any MARCIVE customers. And I should say that MARCIVE was very gracious following up on any of the reported problems, giving us answers quickly, and that was very helpful. In Alma, we had trouble reloading some records that had been fine before. So they were able to come in during our initial implementation of Alma, but in the reload, they failed during the reload. So it was one of those oddities that these are pre-existing records that were, they had errors. Some of them had to do with bad characters, but that was one of the problems. I think that the biggest impact on Alma's side was the time it took to reload. It was much longer than our sample reloads had taken um, before we started the full reload, and it had a impact on all the other jobs that run normally in the job queue. Some of these we had to stop. For example, we have a job that runs daily for records to be published to OCLC, which we then concatenate and send once a week to OCLC. And that was one of the ones we had to stop. Um, and there were others as well. And then after the loads were completed, there was a lot of time where the various jobs that were in the queue also took a long time to finish. And this went on for some time afterwards. In particular, there was an impact on publishing to our catalog Franklin and the re-indexing of Franklin. So partly that was because there was just so many records being re-indexed, but partly it was this problem with the job queue. So we did have some issues there. I wanted to show you the difference between the before and after. And one of the things that we found was the view versions tool in the metadata editor was so useful as we were looking at the sample file and reviewing other records after we completed the project. It was so good to be able to compare what the record looked like before to what it looked like after. And in this case, because of the way this is the way Alma works, the after record is in the left screen and the before record is on the right. And for those of you that haven't used view versions, which I hadn't until we started this project, you have a list of all of the versions with dates. And so we were able to pick the date before we had done the extract as the date to compare if there were multiple records. Sometimes there were only two, but a lot of times there were multiple versions. So we relied on the date to pick. And you can see the record on the right, the before record is not a brief record, but it looks really short. You can get all of it on one screen, where the after record on the left, you can see it's so long, I couldn't do a screen capture of the entire record. I can only capture part of it. I wanted to point out some of the features that you can identify from the MARCIVE project. So the first is the 100 field, where you can see the subfield 0 with the URI. This is one of the outputs of the project that we're very excited to use in the future. And I have some later slides to talk about how we'll be using URIs in the future. And then I've highlighted some of the RDA changes, and you can see the 250 where third edition is now spelled out fully, and the 300 where pages is now spelled out instead of the abbreviation. You can see that the 260 has been changed to a 264, and the 33X fields for content and media and carrier are now in place that weren't in the record previously. And then you can see the beginning of the table of contents for this particular work. And it's a formatted table of contents, which is very helpful for the display. And I will show you an image of the display later on. But you can see how much has changed in this record. And records are very full now. That's been a really nice impact of this project. I wanted to talk some about some of our profiling choices and how they impacted our project. Because there are choices, there are lots of choices when you're doing your profile. The first thing on the list is we chose to add a local field saying that this was edited MARCIVE 2022. And I think the marker is important. If somebody's doing problem solving in the future, they can use that as a key to say, oh yes, this was one of the ones that was processed, and maybe look at those versions to see what might happen. So that was a good choice. I want to talk a little bit about rare books. because this is one of those choices that was offered by MARCIVE that we didn't fully understand or I didn't fully understand the impact of our decision. So one of the things that MARCIVE had suggested was that some libraries process the rare books records using a different profile. And I did talk to the folks in the special collections, and they decided no, we could do it all together. When we did our sample file, there were some problems identified, but in the rush to approve the sample file and move on, I didn't fully appreciate the impact of the RDA upgrades on fields that were entered following the DCRM rules. So the RDA upgrades look odd in some cases from those. Not a critical error, but it just looks different. It's sort of a hybrid between two rule sets. We noticed this it was noticed at the sample, but when we saw the full load and saw the expanse of this, we decided not to include any of the rare materials in our second phase. We could have made the decision earlier and done it a different way, but that's how we handled that issue. Local fields. We have at Penn some local fields that are different from the way other people use these fields. And when we saw some of the processing on them, we decided that we were going to exclude them from the full processing. So that was one of the changes that we made to our profile after reviewing the sample file. Fuzzy matches. So there's various choices about how precisely matches you want to match on headings. And this is one of the things in the profile. We made the choice that if we didn't have an exact match, that we allowed matches, I don't know if fuzzy is the right term, but matches on headings that were close. There are some people, that disagree with this choice at Penn. And but I've only had 3 or 4 reports of it actually being a problem. So given that we corrected 28 million headings, I think 3 or 4 problems it's minuscule. So I really felt like overall this was probably the best choice. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was the 260, 264, because this is one of those things that it wasn't really a problem, but it was a lack of understanding. And most of our 260s were changed to RDA 264s, but not all. And I got repeated questions about why wasn't this record changed and why wasn't that record changed. And as I was preparing for this presentation and going through my email files, I saw that I had asked MARCIVE this question multiple times, and clearly, like the rest of the staff, didn't understand the answer. And that is the reason why not everything changed is that MARCIVE follows the PCC guidelines for automated changes to this, the 260, 262, changing the 260 field from AACR2 to the 264. So there are cases often having to do with multiple volumes, and there's a couple of other cases that were specified 10 years ago when the PCC set up guidelines for this. So I think it's great that because the machine can't make a clear decision, in this case, they're leaving up to the humans to fix those older records with 260s when it's unclear how it should be changed in the 264. But I got asked about it a lot. Okay, switching gears, I want to talk about our local headings processing. And Penn has a working group that's called the DEI and Discovery Team. And the goal of this group is to enhance our catalog and improve outdated terms. So in some cases, this is just maintenance where misapplied headings or old headings that on the records that don't match the content. And those are, catalog or decision kinds of things where it's a correct heading, but it doesn't really match. The example of this that we worked on is African American wit and humor, which should apply to the works of African American comedians, but in some cases was falsely applied in our catalogs to works that were derisive of African Americans. So some of those kinds of heading changes, it's not the kind of thing you can do by machine. But in this case on the screen, the group at Penn decided that we disagreed with the Library of Congress subject heading changes for illegal aliens and related terms. And we decided to use different terminology. And so we created this grid for MARCIVE to add these as additional subject headings in our catalog. So you can see that we applied it both at the beginning of the process before they did our updating of authority. So they did it for both current LCSH terms and non-current ones. And we used terminology that we consider less offensive than the choices, both before and after the change that the Library of Congress made. And this was one of the services that I think was important in deciding to use MARCIVE, because they offered this service in addition to the other ones we already talked about. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things we didn't anticipate that we sometimes call oddities because they were unexpected. And a couple of these relate to the change to RDA, which happened about 10 years ago. And one of them was that this switched from the 260 to the 264 that I had mentioned earlier. Apparently, one of our bibliographic citation tools that the public uses had not been updated to allow for 264. So for the last 10 years, people have been using this citation tool and never noticed that in some cases there was no publication information. But once we flipped most of our records to the current 264, all of a sudden when people were using the citation tool, they were no longer seeing the publication information. So it was presented to me, what did MARCIVE do? Well, MARCIVE didn't do anything except fix the records to the way they should have been. What happened was somebody failed to make the connection between where all the places that MARC is used, and there's a trickle down, and you have to think about some of those. The other oddity was the 245 subfield H, and if you remember, this is where we had video recordings, microform, other format information in square brackets with the title. Well, it turned out after this project was done that one of our developers had been using the contents of this 245H in the script as a filter to limit sets. So he needed to send a set of all records, but not the microfilms. So using microform as a shorthand in the H to limit the set, yes, it could be done with, and it was done to update it to include the 3x fields, which has the same data in a different format. But again, things change and people don't realize the impact of changes over the years. And when everything changes at once, you start to see these things rise up. And the last thing was the URIs, which I've mentioned a couple of times already. They, in some fields, some heading fields, but not all, they displayed to the public once we had the records loaded. And so we had to update our display profile in our Franklin catalog, which is a blacklight instance, to make sure that they weren't displaying. It was very noticeable because one of the fields where they showed up was the author field, which of course is right at the top of the record. I think also some subject headings had the URI displaying. It just made for an odd look until they were able to fix it. So talking about Franklin, our catalog, I wanted to talk about how the changes impacted the catalog. So I mentioned earlier, it's a local instance of blacklight sitting on top of Alma. And so we have a lot of control of how things display and index because of that. We have in the full display of our record, we have the notes and the subject headings displaying in the detail section at the lower part of the record, and that's where the summary notes and the table of contents display. We index both of those in the keyword index, which is terrific because by adding these, we've added a lot more natural language, uh, a lot more descriptive terms that the author used in creating a book. So chapter titles are the words of the author generally. So I think it really helps with getting more hits when people are searching keyword indexes, which is primarily what they search. Additionally, the table of contents are indexed in the title keyword, which is great if you're looking for an essay, or maybe you don't even know it's in a book, but it gives that extra search if you're looking, you're looking for a title. Not, however, in the title browse, but you have that benefit. So here's a look at the same record we looked at earlier in the MARC view. Now I'm going to show you the view in Franklin. And because the record is so long, I cut it up into two sections. So the top of the record before the holdings has the citation kind of information. And then the details section includes the subject heading, the form genre, summary contents, and also other contributors further down. Again, this record is now so long that I can't show you the entire record on the screen, but you can see the very detailed summary note and then the formatted table of contents, including the page numbers, which is really excellent. We do hear a lot from the subject librarians and bibliographers, folks that work with the public, that how often they're seeing table of contents in when they're doing searching. And in fact, somebody said that they know that there were records retrieved because of the presence of these summary and table of contents notes. So I really believe that this was a huge benefit to the public. And as you may remember with the earlier statistics, we added over 100,000 contents notes and over 300,000 summary notes. So they're very visible. And it really is true that most of the time you're seeing records for these. I should note that both of these come from a database that starts primarily in the 1990s in terms of publication dates and is chiefly English, but for the majority of our users, you do see a lot of these. I also heard from a metadata librarian about how the consistency of data is really important, and that he hopes that it will enhance his analytic reports because having the details more consistent does help when you're trying to pull very specific sets. And then just the general that people think it's a success. I wanted to move on to what our future plans are and talk a little bit more about URIs. And the Penn Libraries is very interested in the use of linked data, and having so many new additional URIs in our records gives us some real options for putting into place some linked data projects. And our metadata head of metadata research pulled some numbers in preparation for this. And so you can see that just to check in various fields to see how often the URI appears, and then thinking about how we might use this. He also checked the moving from those URIs to Wikidata, and then moving from Wikidata to Wikimedia Commons to see how many of these things we could connect the author with the LC/NAF ID to an image or additional information. So it's a good solid number for that. And then you can also see that we have a huge increase in FAST references in our records. 71% of the total catalog has a FAST reference, and as well as decent numbers in the other fields. So having the URIs in MARC, some people refer to it as linky MARC, gives you a step in the direction of linked data, but it also allows you to do something with the records. And so here's what we are looking at for our future plans. And we're hoping to use the URIs to do some display improvements in our catalog. And One of the things that this mock-up shows is that we can use the URI, in this case for Bach, to pull in data from Wikidata in this area, and then also an image from Wikimedia Commons, and in this case, some other additional links out, such as to the Wikipedia article. This is a mock-up, so we'll probably streamline this some before we actually implement it. This is a lot of landscape on this particular page, and it's a proof of concept. So for all of our changes, we have a strong UX focus. So we would do testing with users on if we decide to move forward with this implementation, on how it might display, and get feedback from users of various categories so that we had a sense of how helpful this would be. Another prototype that we've looked at is whether we could do the same kind of process, but instead of using on the full record, just enhance the hit list with author images, so that when somebody is looking for, has done a search, they can see and maybe get some more context for which of the items they may want to choose. So these are mock-ups, but we think there's a lot of potential there, and having these URIs in the record helps with that potential. So to wrap up, I wanted to pull together some thoughts about this project and what we might have done differently, and if you're considering it, how you might wish to think about planning for it. So the first thing is plan for enough time. 6 weeks at the end of the fiscal year was not ideal for us, and probably might not be for you either, but we made it work. And with the assistance of the great staff at MARCIVE and the support of Ex Libris, we were able to actually complete this in the time frame we set out. But it was stressful, and so if you can set it up for a longer time period and have put thoughts into some of these things, I think it would be really helpful. When you're completing the profile, it's not a one-person job. Get input, get lots of input from people with different perspectives, because it really does help. And as a manager and administrator, I'm pretty far from the day-to-day cataloging. So some of my initial pass through, I got some people saying, no, we don't want to do it that. We want to do it this way. So it's good to have people boots on the ground in different kinds of perspectives. So the global studies versus the general catalogers versus music and rare, and just to hear the different voices when you're doing the profile. And also the same people are important for reviewing the sample data. I think if we had had more time, I would have wanted to make that a longer process, because we might have done a few tweaks in our profile if we had taken more time at that point. Plan for the cataloging freeze. You don't want staff to be editing records while they're out being updated, and because the process took longer than we had anticipated, our freeze was longer than anticipated. The first batch, I think, was easier in terms of the freeze because they were older records, but we definitely did get emails. Can we start working again? Can we use this? Can I edit this? And so make sure you plan and communicate all about that time period, and people understand why they shouldn't be editing records. Oh, I should note that they were able to add items and update holdings and do orders and all those kinds of things. It was just the bibliographic record that was frozen. Set policies about editing after the reload. I got lots of questions and that I hadn't even thought through. Things like, do I need to update my load profile so that we don't erase any URIs? And it was like, oh, wow, I hadn't even considered that thought. We decided not to, because we figured that all in all, we wouldn't lose a huge number of them, because most of our batch loads are for new records from vendors for new books, new cataloging, new orders. And the other question I got a lot is, can I edit this summary note? And that was absolutely yes, because most of the summary notes are publisher blurb types of notes, and some of them are lovely and there's lots of good content, but there are some that are clearly marketing and some of them that aren't complete or full. So as they're found, yes, people are allowed to edit. Um, and then finally, just communicate. Um, Communicate with the staff, communicate with all the folks that are going to be reviewing the profile and the sample data, communicate with your vendors. A great communication with MARCIVE, and we had great support from Ex Libris, but all of that takes time and it's got to be planned as part of the project. I'll turn it back to Leah now.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that presentation. It was really interesting to see the before and after records, and I think that's going to be really helpful for our Alma customers, and especially the ones that use Blacklight. If you are interested in working with Marchive, feel free to reach out at info@marchive.com.